Hello, very beautiful community. Trump has written a letter to the Prime Minister of Norway that is so unhinged that it's making front page news and is indeed a public embarrassment for the United States. We're going to read it line by line because you can't do it justice without reading it line by line, because virtually every single line is unhinged, on a par with an extremely petulant 2 to 5 year old on a particularly bad day. So let's get into it, beautiful community. So this is a letter to Jonas Gastore. Dear Jonas, we're going to take it line by line. Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize. So this is Trump stewing in narcissistic anger. Your country has decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize. So this is a kind of regression under narcissistic injury, you know? So, you know, they denied the Nobel Peace Prize, and now I'm stuck with this narcissistic injury, under the pressure of which my psychic organization has completely collapsed, which is why Trump is all over the place in this letter. And I've just put up primitive defenses and completely given up on responding to this with adult capabilities, right? As always, we say that a narcissist deals with the adult world with a child's conception of adult capabilities. So in that state of dysregulation, loss cannot be tolerated, ambivalence cannot be tolerated, and responsibility cannot be owned to any extent at all, right? And so the injury is expressed not as disappointment, but as a completely overwhelming loop of rage, humiliation, sense of betrayal, and so on. So if you're responding to this and you don't have a narcissistic personality disorder, you're going to try to put this in context. You might delay your reaction. You might try to reestablish a sense of proportion. But Trump responds by fixating and replaying and enlarging this mind loop of grievance, right, that has total control over him. And it's very important that people with narcissistic personality challenges regularly get worse with age. That's what we're saying. And I'll say something really important about that, because there are two central frames that you hear apply to Trump in our culture, and both are wrong. Now, Trump in particular also has real difficulty disengaging attention. He has real difficulty with emotional impulsivity, and he has very, very poor inhibitory control under stress. So another way of putting it would be that if you're a narcissist caught up in this grievance loop of narcissistic injury, and on top of that you have not very well regulated ADHD, that's just going to dramatize your narcissistic injury even further. For having stopped 8 wars plus. So really for Trump, reality testing has collapsed by this point, right? In favor of a kind of a fantasy of achievement. So it's a kind of a manic defense whereby you are dramatically exaggerating to ward off a sense of inadequacy. And that's why it's, 6 wars, 7 wars, 8 wars, it could be 11 wars next month. I no longer feel obliged to think purely of peace. So here you've got a kind of a moral splitting, because Trump is simply expelling responsibility for aggression. He's saying that he is forced into aggression, he is forced into domination because others fail to reward him. Right? This is a 4-year-old. And there's a kind of move here, which is, if you're not good to me, then I'm myself freed from the responsibility to be good to anybody. Although it will still be predominant, my desire for peace, I can now think about what is good and proper for the United States of America. And so this is very, very important, because private rage is relocated onto an institutional role. Obviously, Trump couldn't give a hoot about what's good for America. He can't even really have that thought. He can't even have the thought of what's good for Melania, because of his narcissistic personality disorder. And so what happens is that an intolerable affect arises, this loop of grievance and rage, and that affect is then expelled onto an external object. And then that external object is pressured to carry the effect in a certain way. You know, I am stuck in a rage loop, but I'm going to say that what's really happening is that the United States has certain entitlements. I mean, let's take a completely private life example, just make one up on the spot. Imagine that you have narcissistic personality disorder and I am sick. And I'm taking my medication. And you tell me, oh, Vlad, you are taking the wrong medication. And I say, well, hang on, I've actually consulted the 4 or 5 leading specialists in the world on my condition, and they told me to take this medication rather than the one you suggest. A normal response would be, oh, interesting. I thought that the other medication might be good, but obviously you say that all the specialists recommend that one. I understand now. What's a narcissistic personality disorder response? It might be something like, all the doctors think it's wrong. So the narcissist has just heard that doctors say that you should be taking the particular medication you're taking. But the narcissist had to expel their affect onto an external object. In Trump's case, this is the United States. In this narcissist example case, it's the medical profession. And notice that's happened even though they just got told that the medical profession doesn't agree with them. So the response isn't, I still think you should take the one that I've said you should take. The response is, all doctors are going to be aghast about it, right? So that's this very, very important move that narcissists regularly make. And this is how Trump is going to be pushing on what in ideological terms is his monarchist ideology, which is just a me ideology. Nobody should have any checks on my power. And he's going to be pushing it, right, by externalizing his affect in a completely deceptive way onto other bodies, other institutions. Denmark cannot protect that land from Russia and China. So here Trump is actually not very triggered. He's just lying. He doesn't give a hoot about protecting much from Russia. And what he's doing right now favors China very much. And so he says this as Mr. Putin is invited onto the Gaza Peace Board. So this isn't Trump being triggered. This is actually just him using some manipulative post-truth communication. And why do they have ownership anyway? And so this is again an attack on any container that limits desire. I want it, and because I want it, I really want it, there's something very, very grievance-inducing about any obstacle in my way. and I must smash it through. There are no written documents, which is a kind of a childlike origin story here. And this is profoundly humiliating. I mean, this is one of the most humiliating lines for all human beings, really, and certainly for all US citizens. It's only a boat that landed there hundreds of years ago, but we had boats landing there too. Let's not do history here, because obviously he'd be talking about a period presumably before the United States existed. But let's do a little bit of psychology. So imagine that you're 5 and that your 5-year-old friend Susan has a toy that she's not letting you play with, and you just want it for yourself. And you're told by your parents that actually Susan's parents bought her this toy a year or two ago, and it's hers because she really wanted it and they bought it for her. And you say, that doesn't count because a year or two ago, I myself walked into the same store too. And so the toy isn't really hers. Right? There's no way to position this properly in an adult mind. But you could hear that from a 4-year-old on a very, very bad day. And that's essentially what Trump is saying here. Trump has been told that the toy got bought for Susan a year or two ago by her parents. And he doesn't say, actually, her parents intended to buy it for me, but gave it to her. No, he says, it's mine, because I actually also walked into the store there a similar period of time. When I was little, toys were quite expensive in the Soviet Union, and I wanted a game. I think it was called Manager, which is really the Soviet equivalent of Monopoly. And I'd walk into the shop and I'd look at it, I think for 2 or 3 years in a row, because I felt the price was too high to ask my parents. Eventually I did ask, and they did buy it for me, but year 3 of wanting it. And so I'd been walking into this store and looking at this. I think it must have cost something like, if that's even possible, that's really a lot. I have a figure of 16 rubles. But then I played with another young person who already had that game. And so it'd be a bit like me saying, your game is mine because I walked into that shop and I looked at it and I wanted it. And, here I'm completely unmoved by the fact that it's actually got bought for that kid and it didn't yet get bought for me. So, as a 5-year-old, I managed to handle that. And most 5-year-olds probably would too. Trump can't. So it's sort of ownership exists only as immediate experience. And things that limit desire are declared as unreal. I have done more for NATO than any person since its founding, which is really what Trump says when he has in mind the fact that he thinks he's got European countries to pay more for defense. And now NATO should be doing something for the United States. And here we're back to where we were before, the externalization. The United States is just me. There is no United States for Trump, just like there's no Russia for Putin. The world is not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland. So complete and total control is not a strategy, it's not adult language, right? It's a kind of it's magical repair of wounded narcissism, right? Through kind of imagined mastery. And of course, we don't even mention the fact that Trump has not said anything concrete about buying it. It's not made clear how remotely he could afford it if he could buy it. And of course, the Greenland move is not in the national security strategy, which we discussed a few weeks ago. But this is so psychologically unhinged that we don't even need to talk about such political details. Thank you, President DJT. So, who is he thanking? He's thanking Norway, even though the issue is Greenland. He's thanking Norway because he's brought the Nobel Prize issue into it. And the trouble here is that the Norwegian government doesn't decide who gets the Nobel Prize. And this is Putin-like thought, right? Putin thinks that if something happens in the United States or in the UK, the government is responsible for it. Putin thinks if the BBC says something, Keir Starmer told it to say that. And so Trump thinks, well, people in Norway must run this thing, and so I must just ask them, because that's how it works. This is a kind of a monarchist conception of political control and political legitimacy. What does this all mean analytically? It means that two things should go out of the window. The first is what I call strategic normalization of Trump that was very, very common, and to a degree is still happening from sort of YouTube platforms like Trigonometry to public intellectuals like Neil Ferguson, who are trying to say that Trump's foreign policy is realist in that way, Kissingerian in this way, and that before Trump was elected for the second time, and indeed before Trump was elected for the first time, was unserious. It was in the realm of farce, this kind of normalization of Trump. But it's interesting that it's still carrying on. In other words, Trump is related to as a very, very badly behaved and erratic version of some kind of strategic school, some kind of foreign policy approach, for instance, that was dominant in a particular moment of US history. That is so profoundly unserious that you shouldn't stop reading the books of people who make these claims, if they're good books they've written in the past, like Neil Ferguson has written some really good books. The Cash Nexus is particularly a book I still recommend. He wrote 25 years ago. But this is not people like Neil Ferguson being wrong, right? This kind of conceptualization of Trump is in the realm of farce. It's not a mistake. It's farce. So we've got to get rid of that. The other thing that we've got to get rid of that I'm seeing a lot of is the cognitive decline and dementia direction. There's very little evidence of Trump being in the kind of cognitive decline that Joe Biden was in. He just isn't. What is happening, however, is that he is increasingly in unchecked power, and his narcissism is not just being exacerbated by that, but it's also being exacerbated, quite frankly, by age. So this is a man experiencing a narcissistic degeneration, not cognitive decline of the Biden kind, where you can't remember which day it was and you can't remember what word follows, the word you uttered previously. That's not Trump. So I'm not impressed with that. And there's now a grift industry about that, diagnosing Trump with various kinds of dementia. This is not what's happening. What we've got is power plus narcissistic personality disorder degenerating, right? In a way that's synergistic with unchecked power, increasingly unchecked power, by the standards of Western democracies at least. And you add to that neurodiversity and the dysregulation associated with that, which just dramatizes Trump's narcissistic deterioration. So he will keep getting worse. This is not the bottom. But it doesn't follow from that you need to talk about Alzheimer's or dementia. This is not the direction of what's going wrong. The direction of what's going wrong is roughly power, narcissistic personality disorder, and then the exacerbation of that by neurodiversity. A bit of political analysis, just very briefly, that's worth making. if Trump is allowed to get away with behavior like this, where he has managed to put together whatever these are, 7, 11, 14 utterly unhinged sentences, and institutionally the United States can't do anything about him, he can't be checked, this is going to be gravely damaging to trust in institutions, no matter who replaces Trump. So this is doing enormous damage to the minimal degree of shared trust that a democracy depends on for survival. So yes, this is ludicrous and a joke and beyond the joke, but it's also, unfortunately, profoundly disinhibiting for US political institutions and trust in those institutions. And that's really, really unfortunate. We're going to talk more soon. Lots of love.